We've mentioned many times that as special as Avraham was, as special as his wife Sarah, they were, but if Avraham would not have a child, he cannot be a patriarch and she cannot be a matriarch. She's not a mother of a child who is the founding mother of the Jewish people, because there's not going to be a Jewish people. And Avraham, well, as great and as special as he is, and God promises the world, but if he has no child, there's no future. There's nothing to carry on. So Hashem gives Avraham a child at the age of 100. Sarah Imenu, Sarah the matriarch, has a son at the age of 90. Now Yitzchak is 37 years old, and he has no wife. So if he has no wife, again, you may have the son, but you cannot, a patriarch is not a patriarch unless there's a matriarch. Of course, there has to be a succession. It has to carry on. And unless it carries on, it stops right there. So Avraham has to locate a wife for Yitzchak, who's qualified to be the matriarch, to be the foundation for the people that will be the eternal people, a people who will eventually assume the potential and the capacity to be the equivalent of Adam before the sin, meaning to spiritualize the world, to advance their souls. And unless you have the appropriate matriarch, it's not going to happen. It's just not marrying a woman and having a child. That child has to be a special child. And the child is special only if the parents are both special, that each one is classified as patriarch, matriarch. Avraham understood that in terms of the genealogy of the woman, it has to be of the same gene pool as himself and as Sarah Imenu. Sarah was Avram's niece. She was the daughter of his brother who had given his life not to bow to the idol. Lot, his nephew, was a brother of his wife, was Sarah's brother. So Lot was Avram's brother-in-law and was his nephew, both. And we find that even eventually, although Lot had committed incest with his daughters, as the Torah tells us the story, they believed the world was destroyed after the stone was wiped off the face of the map, and they conceived from their father, Ammon and Moab. The Ammonites and the Moabites are descendants of Lot and his daughters. Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth the Moabite, who converted centuries later to become the wife of Boaz, who was a prince of the tribe of Judah, who was the grandmother of David HaMelech, King David. So even though she's a convert, but in terms of a genealogy, the genealogy goes back to Lot and his daughters, which again are from the same gene pool as Avraham himself is and his wife. And now his son needs a wife from the family. Any other person other than his own genealogy will not be sufficient to establish this eternal people, that this should be the foundation for the eternal people. So the Torah tells us he summons a slave, the elder of his household, who oversaw all his financial affairs. And he tells them, I'm commissioning to find a wife for my son. Now, he's referred to as the elder of his household, the one who oversees all his affairs. Avraham Avinu was a very wealthy man, as was discussed, how he became wealthy and wealthier, and how the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Avraham, how they were in a disagreement and they were quarreling because the grazing land was not quite sufficient for both of them, and the shepherds of Lot were stealing the grazing land. And because the shepherds of Avraham were mentored by him, theft was unacceptable in any circumstance. And they couldn't coexist, and they separated. This is the story of Avraham. But ultimately, even Lot being within the proximity of Avraham was a problem, because God says you have to separate from your family. And until Lot separated from Avraham, God did not have that special, intentional, original understanding of a relationship. As the Torah says, only after Lot separated from him did God appear to Avraham in Canaan. And he told him, the land will be your children, and so on and so forth. Meaning, that level of relationship, which was the precursor for Avraham to be the patriarch of the Jewish people, he says, the land will be your progenies. Progeny means there's going to be a future. So he had Yitzchak eventually, the miracle child. He had, if Yitzchak is the miracle child, to be the future patriarch, we need an appropriate matriarch. So he instructs Eliezer, who oversees all his affairs, who actually was taught all the Torah that Avram knew, and he would disseminate it. And he radiated a holiness which was a semblance of his master's holiness. As Moshe Rabbeinu radiated holiness, Avram radiated holiness, and so did Eliezer, his slave. And despite his dimension of spirituality, his slave, and his track record, and his dedication to his master, nevertheless, Avram adjured him with an oath, the most extreme level of oath, to bind him that he's committed to this instruction and this mission exactly as Avram had instructed him. He cannot deviate as much as an iota. Not even whatever he believes may be better or in Avram's best interest. He has to follow Avram's instructions, as we say, to the T. Exactly. And if you should violate them, he forfeits his physical life and he forfeits his spiritual place in the world to come. That's how, if a person has a relationship over many, many years, and you've proven yourself beyond any doubt that you will even give your life for your master. Or was it a question of trust? He adjured him because he didn't trust him. Why exactly did he adjure him? For what reason? So we'd spoken in the past, whenever we're about to reach a moment, a milestone in spirituality, which does not pre-exist that moment, there's always an intervention of Satan, of Satan trying to disrupt it, not allow it to happen. Always. The greatest moment of the history of existence was when the Jews stood at the foot of Sinai and God offered us the Torah. And we said, Nasa v'nishma. We accepted it unequivocally. We had the 10 commandments. Moshe ascends to heaven 40 days and 40 nights. And Moshe says, I will be in heaven 40 days and nights. Moshe ascended in the daytime. So the day he ascended was not counted as one of the days, which was included in the 40 days. The Jews misunderstood this, misunderstood it. And they calculated the time, and they realized Moshe is not back. Evidently, seemingly, Moshe died. So the link to God was their past, they were idolaters, and they understand where they're not at. How are we supposed to continue without Moshe being the intermediary between us and God? So what happens? The rabble, which left Egypt with Moshe, introduce the golden calf. They suggest we'll have another intermediary, which was the deity of Egypt, the golden calf. And the Jews, they were actually convinced that's the way to go, because this was unfortunately, the background for many years in Egypt. We became pagans. Not only that, Satan went and he caused the world to become dark, and they saw in heaven the remains of Moshe lying on a bed, and he was being carried, floating in the heavens in this darkness. This is what Satan did. And they believed when they saw that, in addition to Moshe not returning, Moshe was no longer alive. And what happens? They got involved in the golden calf. Moshe comes down a day later, and God says to Moshe, you must descend immediately. Your people have become corrupted. They're serving alien gods. Moshe goes down, he sees them celebrating, rejoicing around this golden calf. He's incensed. He takes the 10th commandments and he smashes them to the ground, breaks them. The letters ascend heavenwards. The letters were made of fire. The symbolism of those letters ascending heavenward meant the Torah will be forgotten from the Jewish people. If the tablets, if the luchos, 10 wouldn't have been broken, any Torah the Jews would have learned prior to that moment would have been etched and emblazoned in their memories and their souls, never to be forgotten. But because he broke the tablets, meaning they were not worthy of that level of relationship, the letters floating were symbolic of gradual forgetting. It's going to fade out. I'd once said, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, that when the Jews said Nasa v'nishma, we ascended to a level of before the sin of Adam, and the Jews at that moment were no longer subject to death. And we would have lived forever. The world would have achieved its level of perfection, and the sin of Adam would have been corrected. But because we failed with the golden calf, we reverted back to post-sin, and we're subject to death. But if we wouldn't be subject to death any longer. Now, the Gemara tells us that forgetting is a gift of God, that a human being is able to forget. Why? Because we don't even realize what it means to forget. I always give the example. You see a puddle of water in the morning, and then the sun rises. By midday, there's just a remnant of that puddle on the ground. It's slightly damp. By afternoon, it's not there. It's like the puddle disappeared. What do we do? It evaporated. It's a gradual evaporation, is a gradual process. Evaporation. Forgetting means person doesn't forget in a moment, but over time, it starts fading out. And the Gemara tells us that when a person loses a loved one, if the first moment of pain and grief would continue at that level, a person would not be able to survive. Humanly, you could not survive. So God gave a gift to humanity. It's called forgetting. And because we forget, therefore, over time, as we say, time heals. Take time, but with time, it lightens. Although you have a vivid memory of the person, but it's still not the same. It has to be at that level of emotional internalization of whatever that loss is. If that would continue, you couldn't survive. So forgetting was a gift of God. Now, if the Jews wouldn't have sinned with the golden calf, death had no relevance to the Jewish people. If that is the case, there's no reason to forget. What is the value of forgetting? If forgetting was only introduced to humanity to survive the trauma of death of a loved one, so if nobody dies any longer, it's not a gift. It's a negative. The consequence is very negative. Because now what you should remember, you're not going to remember any longer. So if the Torah is meant to be emblazed and etched in your mind and your emotion, and not and it should have the same vibrancy and the same impact as the first moment. If it starts fading, there's a serious handicap. So forgetting is a handicap. It doesn't have any aspect of positiveness. But when Moshe broke those tablets, we reverted back to post-sin at that moment. At that moment, post-sin, that means death has relevance even to the Jewish people. Once there's death, we have to have forgetting. Once you have forgetting, the letters of the Ten Commandments, which represent the Torah, floated heavenward, which indicated the fading process, which was a forgetting process. That's what it was. Now, we're at the pinnacle, and we've achieved the ultimate purpose of existence. For the sake of Torah, the world was created. For the sake of Jewish people, Torah was created. We accepted it unequivocally, which God was astounded. He says, who revealed this expression, these words to my people, to my children? They speak like angels. But you want to know something? When God created Satan, he has certain leeway that if he's able to topple the apple cart, he topples it. And he toppled it. By the Jews misunderstanding the timeline when Moshe is supposed to return, right away they were worried. And the rabble immediately said, you know something? We have to revert back to an intermediary because Moshe is no longer alive to be the intermediary. And therefore they were influenced to consider idolatry. And then Satan comes on the top of that, darkens the world, and they see the image of Moshe floating as a corpse, his remains on a bed. That was the final convincing reality. But this was all Satan. But it was at that moment, that moment, which the ultimate would have achieved, at that moment, he strikes to the heart of everything and destroys everything. Because after that, the relation with God was no longer the same. We had a Mishkan, which that was a medium through which we had a relation with God. The relation was no longer at that original level, if they wouldn't have sinned with the golden calf. So we see, whenever there's a moment where there's going to be a transition to a new dimension of spirituality, Satan interferes. And he won. He succeeded. Avraham is going to the Akedah. And this is the ultimate test. And if he succeeds, this will silence Satan's prosecution forever, the merit. He left no stone unturned to not allow this to happen. When he came in as a raging river, at the end, as we said, what was the consequence of the Akedah? Sarah Imenu, his partner in life, passes away. And that's a basis for him to be upset and to literally regret that he ever did the Akedah, which would have actually eradicated and destroyed the record of the Akedah. Avraham was able to remain silent, did not succumb to this. But what did Satan try to do? He tried to undo, to topple and unhinge that merit. Didn't succeed. Fast forward. We're in the second year of the desert. We're about to enter into the land of Canaan, the promised land. This is the ultimate location where God wants us to be. This is the land, the Holy Land. We're going to build a Beis Hamikdash. Mashiach is going to come. Destruction of Amalek. What happens? All of a sudden, the people say, including the princes of the tribes, we have to send scouts to scout out the land. Never know. And the reason why they wanted scouts, although that's not what they said, was because they really questioned God's intention. Why is he bringing them there? And as it proved, when they came back, it's a land that destroys its inhabitants. God wants to destroy us. But you imagine, we're about to cross into the promised land, which is the ultimate objective of the development of the Jewish people. That's our location. And now we're way late for 40 years. And we wander for 40 years until that whole generation dies. Could you imagine? We're about to cross the line, the finish line. the ultimate finish line. Satan puts a hook in us, doesn't let us cross. Like years ago, you used to see the longshoremen. There's these hooks, they put it in the bail, and they were able to, regardless, hold it back. That's the way Satan put his hook into us. By putting that thought in our minds to question, why is God doing, are we really worthy? It's only to destroy us. Okay? Finally, that generation passes away. We're in the 40th year. We have a whole issue. Balpor, Bilam is commissioned to curse the Jewish people. And Bilam advises the king of Moab, Balak, the God of the Jews will not tolerate licentiousness. Sexual impropriety will not under any circumstance. So what happened? The daughters of Moab came out and they actually enticed the Jewish people with this idolatry. And the Jews, many of them, failed. The prince of Shimon cohabited publicly with the princess of the Midianite princess. If not for the intervention at that moment of Pinchas, who was the ultimate zealot, the Torah tests factually, God would have destroyed the Jewish people. Could you imagine? Satan's victory. That there's a Jewish people, that's everything which is contrary to what Satan's all about. And he nearly succeeded. But because of Pinchas' intervention, his zealotry, execution was annulled. It was put at bay. It was put to rest. Pinchas achieved the ultimate level. He was born a Levi. That was a testifier. Pinchas was promoted to Kohen. Pinchas lives forever. Pinchas is Eliyahu Novi. Elijah the prophet is Pinchas. He will be the forerunner to the coming of Mashiach. He will inform us. He's known as the Mavasir. Okay? So the Jews continued. 40 years, this is the new generation. What happens now? All of a sudden, the Jews get this newfangled, crazy idea in their heads. We've been eating this manna for 40 years. We're about to cross into the promised land. We're ready to cross the Jordan, the Yarden. All of a sudden, we've been eating this food for 40 years, this miracle food. We haven't expelled it from our bodies. Don't you think eventually, it's unheard of, this food will expand in our intestines and our intestines will burst and we're going to die. So God gave us this food ultimately that we shouldn't survive. We had enough of this wafer food. We want the real thing. Like they said, we want the grub wagon. The grub wagon was the end of the wagon train. That was like the caboose. We want, what does God do? He sends vipers. And the Jews are bitten. And Jews are dying. Could you imagine? We're already holding at the entry point of going to the promised land. This is the new generation. The old generation died. Satan doesn't give up. Again, he's trying to topple the apple cart. Again, okay? The Jews repent. He didn't succeed. There were casualties. A little further, about to go in, and Moshe destroys the two great giants, Sichon and Og. And afterwards, past the Bilam story, the tribes of Gad and Asher come, and they say, we'd like to stay on the Transjordan side. We have all these flocks and these herds. We need the grazing land. Moshe Rabbeinu immediately felt history repeating itself. We're going to have another story like the Meraglim with the spies. They're going to disenchant their brothers as they don't want to cross the Jordan. The brothers are not going to want. And Moshe Rabbeinu immediately said to them, are you trying to behave like your forefathers? And we were way late for 40 years. So they said, no, of course, we're going to go cross the Jordan with our brothers and we're going to conquer and we're going to divide and then we're going to return. So for 14 years, they left their families on the Transjordan side. But again, Initially, it wasn't really such a great idea. The first tribes to be exiled of the 10 tribes were the tribes that are on the Transjordan side. Why? Because they already showed their interest they valued the material more than the spiritual. I mean, if you're able to go into the promised land itself, they stay in the suburbs, so to say, the Transjordan side. It doesn't have the same dimension of Kedusha, of holiness, as the land itself. But for the sake of grazing land, for the herds, that's a big priority. We prefer to stay there. We'll give anything. We'll leave our families for 14 years. But initially, Moshe felt, because it was so unacceptable, who would want to give up the promised land for the Transjordan side? Evidently, their intention is not pure. So therefore, Moshe, there was a precondition. You will only stay on the Transjordan side if the Jews are secured in Israel proper itself. And once they're settled there, they conquer and divide, then you could go back. And they agreed. But again, it wasn't simple. So we see whenever we reach a level, a milestone in accomplishing spirituality, it's not so simple. Satan immediately throws a monkey wrench into the equation and wants to disrupt everything. Now, getting back to Avraham Avinu, you'd say a person who's the elder of his household, oversees all his affairs, financial affairs, spiritual affairs, everything, and he has a track record. He's been through thick and thin with Avraham, and he says, I'm going to adjure you with an oath that it should violate and deviate as much as an iota for my instruction. You forfeit your physical life and the world to come. Seems to be pretty much of an insult. After what we've been through, you mean you don't trust me? Eliezer understood exactly what it was about. He wasn't offended as much as an iota. Understanding that the wife should be the appropriate wife to be the matriarch of the Jewish people, to be able to achieve that dimension of spirituality, to have the maximum capacity, you have to have that woman who is identified by Avraham with those characteristics. And if it's not, the Jewish people are not going to be at that level. Understanding the machinations of the evil inclination of Satan is going to try to disrupt this. He's not going to let it go. Therefore, he was not offended. He understood exactly why Avraham has to bind him with an oath that there's no wiggle room, no matter what. Regardless of what he believes and what he thinks, he has to follow the instruction to the T. No deviation whatsoever. And he goes. Not only that, the Torah goes and alludes to the objective of this mission. It says he takes 10 camels of his master with all that his master owns. Meaning he gave him a document which stated in the document that Avraham wrote over all his assets to Yitzchak. So he should be an attractive catch for whoever the father of the family of his future wife. She's marrying a very wealthy man. But the Torah goes out of its way to say he took 10 camels from the camels of his master. Why is that an important piece of information? And he took 5 camels, he took 20 camels. Why 10 camels? So it said in the past, because what is the objective of this mission? To meet the objective of creation, which was Asar Ma'amoros Nivra Olam. The world was created with 10 utterances of God. The 10 camels laden with the wealth of his master, those 10 camels was to negotiate the deal for the hand of Rivka, who was going to be the matriarch of the Jewish people, to guarantee and secure the future of the Jewish people till the end of time. That's what it was all about. And Eliezer understood this. Now, he goes and he prays to God. And he originally asked Avraham, how do I know that the woman's going to want to come back? How do we know? He says, God will send his angel. He will make sure, guarantee a success. Okay? He finally goes, and before he meets this young maiden, he prays to God that the young woman comes out, drawing the water, doing exceptional level of chesed. which is a woman who's worthy to be the future matriarch of the Jewish people. And sure enough, all of a sudden, he's by the well over there, the wellspring, and this young woman comes out with a pitcher on her shoulder, and he runs towards her, makes a request, some water, a sip of water, so on and so forth. Story follows. Then he asks her, and what does he do? Immediately, believing that this is the woman, what does he do? He takes a nose ring, and the Torah identifies the weight of the nose ring. It's Becca. Its weight is Becca, whatever that weight is. And he takes 2 bracelets weighing 10 gold weight, and he puts them on her 2 arms. He puts it on immediately. But he asked her originally, and then he asked her, who are you? From which family are you? He should have first asked the question. And now, knowing she's Rivka, the intended wife of Yitzchak, then you give her the nose ring and the bracelets. No. He gave her the bracelet, the nose ring and the bracelets first, and then he asked her who she was. And turned out, she is the one. So Rashi asks, why did he give her the bracelets and the nose ring first, even before asking her? See, Rashi says, because he had faith that in the merit of Avraham, she's the right woman. That's why he didn't ask. And he only asked afterwards to confirm what he believed. So I asked the simple question. How long would it take him to ask the question and get the answer? And know factually that it's her, but then give it a nose ring and the bracelets. But he put it on first because he was so certain, based on the merit of Avraham, that she's the one. Then he asked the question. We're talking about the differential in time is a moment. Ask the question and put them on. You know what the answer is? Eliezer understand. Now, first of all, what was the significance of giving her the nose ring and putting the bracelets on her arms? So Rashi says, why is the Torah telling us the weight of that nose ring and the weight of the bracelets, 2 weighing 10 in gold? It's alluding, the nose ring, the weight is alluding to the machzah shekel. They have the silver coin that the Jewish people will give in the future, which we buy, which the Jews will count, but they purchase the communal offerings. And that's how they will count it. The 2 gold bangles, bracelets, represent the 2 tablets of the Aseret Dibros, and the 10 weight in gold is alluding to the 10 commandments. That's why the Torah tells us the weight, and it was intentional. He was instructed by Avraham, when you find it, put them on her arms and give her the nose ring. Why? What's the significance? What's the significance of that? Because if she's the matriarch, putting it on her arms and giving it to her as that piece of jewelry, that will secure and confirm that in the future, she as the matriarch of the Jewish people, there'll be a machzah shekel, there'll be the half a silver coin, and there'll be 10 commandments. But wait a moment. Find out who she is. You can't take a chance. Satan in the interim, in that one moment, something may topple the apple cart. One moment can make a difference. You know, you're going on a flight, paid a fortune. You miss it by 1 nanosecond, you miss the flight. You're not going anywhere. Satan has the ability, in a blink of an eye, he's able to undo everything. And Eliezer understood this. He understood the value of this mission. This will be determined that there'll be a future, that the objective of creation will be addressed. Satan will do everything he can to interfere, not allow it to happen. Therefore, Eliezer, even before he asks her, based only on believing in the merit of Avraham, she must be the one, he gives her the nose ring, puts those bracelets on her arms to secure and guarantee that if Satan now comes, he can't in any way interfere with this. And he goes, then he asks, what's your name? From which family you come? And sure enough, it's exactly what he believed. But the reason why he didn't even delay a moment is exact for that reason. Okay, fast forward. He goes, he meets the family, and he meets Besuel, the father of Rivka, the special brother-in-law, which you don't wish on anyone, that kind of brother, love on. And he says, I am the slave of Avraham, and I'm here for a mission to find a wife for my master's son. They said, look, let's first have a meal, and we'll talk about it afterwards. He says, no. First I speak my piece, then we eat. Okay? Very nice. So he goes and he gives the whole background, why he's there. It has to be that special family. And he tells him the miracles that he experienced to arrive there and how he prayed and how his daughter presented herself. And with every detail, and how he has a special daughter himself and his special daughter was rejected. Of course, the genealogy of him and their is a different genealogy. Okay, he's ready to do the deal. They sit down and have the meal. And all of a sudden, there's no mention of Rivka's father. All we hear is Lavan, the brother-in-law, and the mother. What happened to Besuel? The night before Besuel was there, he was going to drink a l'chaim with Eliezer to close the deal. And at the end, we don't hear about it. What happened? So Chazal tells, the Midrash tells us, you know what they wanted to do? They had poisoned Eliezer's food. They poisoned it. God sent an angel, switch the portions. So rather than Eliezer eating the food to be poisoned, Besuel, the father of Rivka, he ate it. Therefore, there's no mention of him after this moment. Could you imagine? Miracles took place. He was sure he put the bracelets on our arms, the nose ring. He already presented. They said, we're not going to interfere. And yet, all of a sudden, Besuel's not there. God had to intervene and perform a miracle, switch the portions, that this initiative should not succeed. It backfired on them. Next morning, they rise. Eliezer says, what is the conclusion? You slept on it overnight. Is she coming with you or is she not coming with me? So they said, not so quick. We have to ask the young girl. If she wants to go, we have to ask her. And she says, I'm going whether you like it or not. That was Rivka's response. Whether you like it or not, I'm out of here. So before that, they said, you know, a girl, we have to prepare a trousseau for her. They used to call it a trousseau. Today, they give the credit card, you know, unlimited spending, do what you want. But at one time, a woman had to prepare. Maybe she'd stay for a year, for 10 months, and then she'll go. Eliezer says, I have no time. Now or I'm leaving. So he says, okay, let's ask the young girl. They ask Rivka, she says, I'm out of here. Whether you like it or not, I'm leaving. And she left, okay? So seemingly, Sutton lost the game. Rivka is returning as the matriarch, okay? Let's talk about it. Finally, she comes back to the community of Yitzchak and Avraham. And where was Yitzchak? Yitzchak was on Har Moriah, Mount Moriah, after the Akedah for 3 years. He returns after 3 years. The timing is perfect. As Eliezer returns with the camels, and Rivka, the intended wife for Yitzchak, the Torah tells us that Tipo me'alagama. The word is she fell off the camel. What does it mean she fell off the camel? Do you know who Yitzchak was after the Akedah? He rated a holiness of one of a kind. She sees this man coming, and she says to Eliezer, who is that man who's coming towards us from the field? Says, that's my master, Yitzchak. That's my master. That's your husband. She was so taken aback, she fell off the camel. Why is that important for us to know? So Rashi explains based on one interpretation. She lowered herself off the camel. Even the word tipolni, she fell. But the Medrash says she fell off the camel. She was so overwhelmed with this view, what she saw. She never saw anything like it. She was startled. She fell off the camel. You know what happened when she fell off the camel? She was injured. And she was injured. She lost her virginity due to that injury. Could you imagine? She's finally back. She's about to get off the camel to become his wife. She falls off the camel and has an injury. And now Yitzchak has a question. Why isn't she a virgin? Maybe Eliezer on the way back, she's such a beautiful woman. Maybe he couldn't control himself. Maybe he defiled her. Could you imagine? Because, you know, when we're dealing at this level, Nothing is is not possible. There's nothing impossible. Satan's going to try to stop this no matter what. And he suspected Eliezer, maybe he had relations with her. You know what God does? He immediately summons Gabriel, the archangel, and he says, bring the stone that has the blood of that injury to prove to Yitzchak that Eliezer is innocent and is due to an injury. And she is a virgin, although she lost her virginity due to the injury. Could you imagine? Till the last moment, literally, she's already there. She sees her husband coming. At that moment, Satan was still going to pull the rug out from under us. That she should not be the matriarch. Now, we find the Balaturim writes in this narrative, the word malocho is mentioned twice. He says, but who said I'll succeed? Maybe she's not going to want to come back. Avraham says, God will send his angel that your mission should succeed. Eliezer, when he's telling over the story to the family of Rivka, he says over, God said he will send malocho. Why do you have to share that with them? So the word malocho is mentioned twice in the parsha. So the Balaturim says there were two angels. One was to go with him, and one was to return with him. Two angels. So my question, what do we do? Two angels. Once he succeeded, he has her. You don't need an angel to put her way back. The answer is, as we're explaining, you need an angel till the last moment. Until he consummates that marriage, you need an angel. Why? Because Satan may interfere. And if he interferes, it's not happening. Therefore, God sent an angel to protect him going and returning. And he was only able to return with her as the matriarch. And she was the only one qualified to be the matriarch, only because of who she was, due to the instruction of Avraham knowing this. And therefore, she was established as the matriarch of the Jewish people for that reason. We read regarding when we bake matzah, it says it takes 18 minutes from the time you add water to that flour until the leavening process happens, 18 minutes. And the Torah says, Ushmartem es hamatzos. When you prepare the matzah to bake it, you have to be very vigilant to make sure it doesn't become chametz. Therefore, the moment you add the water, you continue kneading it, because the leavening process only starts when you stop kneading it. They knead it, and they immediately put it in the oven. And it bakes almost instantaneously. That there should not be a question of maybe it became leavened. Ushmartem es hamatzos. Watch over the matzos. Without the vowels, the word matzos could be read mitzvos. Make sure to be vigilant over the mitzvos. What does that mean? That just as you have to be vigilant when you make matzah, it should not become leavened. Mitzvah bo liyotcha al tachmitzeno. A mitzvah that presents itself, do not allow it to become chametz. That's the terminology they use. And it's alluded through that, as you have to be vigilant over the matzah, that it should not become leavened. When a mitzvah presents itself, don't delay its actualization, its execution. Do it immediately. Because if you delay, it could become chametz. We know, when we read about the mitzvah of matzah for 7 days, that a Jew is not permitted to eat 11 product for 7 days, what does chametz represent? The chametz represents, the 11 product represents the evil inclination. What's the difference between matzah and 11 product? Matzah is flat. That represents humility. The leavening process gives it a taste. That represents desire. God says for 7 days during the year, you have to ingest only something that represents humility, and you're weaning yourself from desire. Chometz represents the evil inclination. This will have an effect to secure your immune system, your spiritual immune system, that you'll be able to deflect them to a better degree. Mitzvah bo liyot al tachmitzeno. The mitzvah that presents itself, don't let it be chametz. Why chametz? Why are we using that term? As we're explaining now, whenever you have a mitzvah opportunity, what does that mean? You're able to advance your spirituality, to address your objective, why you exist. You understand? Satan's not allowing it to happen so quick. So how do you preempt Satan? Don't let it become leavened. Immediately, the moment it presents itself, execute it immediately. Because if you allow that delay, you never know what's going to happen. Something may intercede and you're not going to fill it. Eliezer put those bracelets and the nose ring before he asked her name, because he understood in that one moment to ask and get a response, something may happen. He secured it immediately, whatever that represented. And then he asked, it presents itself, don't let it become leavened. Leaven represents the evil inclination. The Gemara tells us that there was one of the people from the Tanoic period, when he would finish his Amidah, he would make a prayer. Like we say at the end, when there's a paragraph, after we conclude the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, he had a supplication. And he said to God, our will is to do your will. It's the yeast in the dough which doesn't let us do it. That interferes. The yeast in the dough. That's the leavening process. The yeast. This is the most extreme level of Satan. He doesn't let it happen. And that's what he's about. The Satan, the evil inclination, that always intervenes and somehow complicates things. For that reason. Now, it's interesting. The Sanhedrin, if you have a case that has to be adjudicated, which carries the death penalty, you have to have a court of 23 judges. Now, let's say you have dissenting opinions and you have other opinions. How do you rule? You rule based on majority. If the majority rule guilty, it's guilty. The majority rule innocent, he's innocent. So they adjudicate it, they discuss it, and finally, we're ready for the count. The count to see how many guilty, how many rule innocent. And based on the number, that will be the basis for the verdict. Do they issue the verdict immediately? They're not permitted to issue the verdict immediately. They have to sleep on it overnight. Sleep means they have to stay all night, reflecting on every one of their positions themselves, discussing it, and in the morning, they give their final decision. Why? Because maybe they may have overlooked something. We're talking about taking a life. It's not a simple matter. Therefore, you let it incubate overnight. Think about it, reflect on it to make sure that your position is correct. That maybe you missed the point, and in the morning, it will give you a decision. So the Talmud uses a term that machmitzim esadin. The verdict, you let it become chometz. Let it sit overnight. Like chometz is only a result of letting something sit. The water, after you add the water to the flour, you let it sit, it becomes leaven. Machmitzim esadin. Let the din become chometz. I mean, how do we even use such a terminology? You mean we can't find a better word to use? I mean, the chometz is the evil inclination. It's Satan. When you give the ruling of the court, let it become chometz. You say you should reflect, think about it, or come up with some other appellation or adjective for that. Chometz. You know what it's telling us. But we always say delay is always a negative. It's a negative. And here we say, no, delay is a positive. The answer is, before you begin studying Torah, Satan will do whatever he can to make sure it doesn't happen, or attempt to make sure. Once you engage in Torah study, the Torah is the antidote. Therefore, it's saying, even though you're delaying the verdict, it doesn't make a difference. Because throughout the night, you're going to be reflecting on the basis for that decision. What is that? That's Torah. Once it's Torah, it's irrelevant, it's chometz. The chometz is what? Is put to rest. It doesn't interfere. You retain your clarity. Not only do you retain your clarity, you reach another level of clarity that when the verdict is given in the morning, when you take the count, it will be an accurate, correct verdict for that reason. The Gemara tells us in Kedushin that before a person's bar mitzvah, he's not obligated. He's considered exempt from everything because he has no obligation. And therefore he has no liability. The moment you enter into adulthood, you assume full obligation. Now, a person's not obligated does a mitzvah, and a person's obligated does a mitzvah. Whose mitzvah is a greater mitzvah? So logically, you would say the person's not obligated, despite the non-obligation, does the mitzvah need the case. But yet the Gemara said, the Talmud says no. Godla mitzvah Yosem Sheni mitzvah. Greater is the one who performs the mitzvah when he's obligated than the one who's not obligated. Why? Seems to be contrary to logic. So the commentators explain, why? Because when you're not obligated, the evil inclination doesn't try to stop you. Because you're not obligated. But when you're obligated, that's when he tries to intervene. So that he tries to intervene, despite that you succeed, that's why the accomplishment is a greater accomplishment. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is we can't take things for granted. We can't rest on our laurels. We can't say, well, we know better, and we have that. We'll have that inspiration. You may have the inspiration, but with everything said, if Avraham Avinu, family patriarch, was concerned to such a degree, and Eliezer we see to literally moments make a difference whether it's going to happen or not, we have to understand the reality of what it is. And when it comes to any mitzvah activity or investment, strike when the iron's hot. Any level of delay, it may not happen. So now, in the Amida, when we pray the bracha of tshuva, Hashivenu v'lu sarasecha, bring us back to your Torah. Malkeinu, our King, to your service. What is that? What's bringing us back? Give us a level of clarity that whenever we see opportunity within the realm of spirituality, allow us to address it and be full beneficiaries of that. Because if we don't appreciate it, there's a certain inertia. We delay, let it be, we'll get around to it. The moment you fall into that niche or that mindset, it's the beginning of the end. Because Satan will not allow it to happen, and ultimately, it may not happen, probably will not happen.